Yeah. Oops. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Sondra.
Good morning.
I am pleased to be back in Israel.
That's wonderful.
It's
What?
How was the flight?
It was fine. It was just fine. I didn't sleep as much as I would have liked, but
Yeah.
I slept some. I landed this morning.
Oh my goodness. Was this
Yeah.
El Al? El Al?
Yeah, I came
Yeah.
back alive.
Yeah.
Yes, landed this morning and came home, unpacked, fell asleep for 2 hours, and then went to work. So,
Oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
Korach kavod. Oh my goodness.
You're
I'll
an
tell you the
iron.
truth, though, I find if you don't go right into the time zone you've landed in and are active within those daylight hours, then you have jet lag. And when I go into, I start working, I'm busy, and then I don't have jet lag, or I have very minor jet lag, not the kind that, prevents me from doing stuff. So anyway, okay, so I would like to ask everybody to mute themselves and just unmute when you have a comment. And this way we can make sure that we don't have the background noises that we've had sometimes in the past when people have forgotten to mute. Let's see. So I think everybody's muted. Excellent. Okay. So today's Torah portion is Korach, and it's a bit of it's an action Torah portion. It's of course about a rebellion. A major rebellion that is staged. This is very different from what we saw until now, where we had here and there complaints and groups of people doing this and that. Although, if you will recall, we found a turning point going back to chapter 11. Okay, going back to chapter 11 in the book of Numbers, where for the first time, we have this massive group of complainers. Okay, and it goes from bad to worse. Last week we discussed the sin of the spies. This week we're now in this major rebellion. So it's not good. Okay, that's number one. Number two, keep in mind that this rebellion takes place after the sin of the spies. So at this point, you might say the people in the nation are saying, here we are, we're stuck. We're stuck in the desert for another 38 years. They don't have as much to look forward to. They may feel they don't have as much to lose, and that may also be something that is fueling this rebellion. But I think in order to get, and I'm teaching, by the way, what I'm teaching today is very much in line with how many commentators view this. I'm not really bringing much new today, but I think it's very important to get this sense and to see how the verses themselves bear out the approach that is such a common one within Jewish interpretive traditions. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the first verse. We're in chapter 16, verse 1. This is the beginning of the rebellion. We learn who it is that rebels. Korach, the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kehat, the son of Levi. That's one group. That's one person. Okay, he took himself along with Datan and Abiram, or Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Pelet, all sons of Reuben. And they rose against Moses, together with 250 of the children of Israel, who were the princes or the chiefs of each of the tribes. Okay, very important people. So we have here basically three groups of people. We have Korach, who is a Levite. We have Datan and Aviram, who are, and this On Ben Pelet, who ends up disappearing afterwards. We don't hear about him again. They are the sons of Reuben. And then we have a third group who are 250 leaders of the tribes. Okay. Now, let's look at each one and what is it that binds them together, or more accurately, what are they complaining about? What is their motivation? And like so many rebellions, this is a rebellion not about any principle. This is a rebellion about who should be the leader. This is an attempt to overthrow the appointed leadership, the leadership of Moses and Aaron. And they are basically coming and challenging the very authority of Moses and Aaron. And we see that in their statement in verse 3. What do they say? They said, all the community are holy, and the Lord is in their midst. Why do you raise yourselves above the Lord's congregation? In other words, we're all just as good as you. What makes you chief? They're saying to Moses and Aaron. So each one of these people really are coming from a different type of resentment, shall we say, against Moses and Aaron. So first of all, Korach. Who is Korach? We learn that he is the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kehat. Now, Kehat has 4 sons. We learn this in Exodus 6, in verse 18. There's in Exodus 6, there is a bit of a genealogy of the tribe of Levi, and we learn they have 4 sons: Amram, Yitzhar, Hebron, and Uzziah. Hebron and Uzziah we don't really hear from, but Amram's sons, Amram had 2 sons. His sons were Moses and Aaron. Yitzhar has Kehat, that's his son. So essentially, first of all, Kehat is a first cousin of Moses and Aaron. And basically then, he's coming from a position of, he's saying, look, Kehat had more than one son. He didn't just have Amram. He also had Yitzhar, our father. Yitzhar is also a son of Kehat. So how come all of the leadership appointments go to the sons of Amram? How come nothing is left for the sons of Yitzhar? So that is, again, we're talking about when, and it's by the order in which they're mentioned, Amram and then Yitzhar. Yitzhar seems to be the second son after Amram, closest in age, and it's typical. Okay, we know this even as we're raising our children. Second child is always in a race to catch up with the first, always. And this very much could be coming from the same kind of situation. Okay, that's the first group. The second group is these Reubenites, particularly Datan and Aviram. Okay, now Reuben, what happened to him? Reuben is the firstborn. And already when it was just the 12 sons of Jacob, we got a sense Reuben is being shuffled aside. We talked about this when we discussed the book of Genesis. Reuben is shuffled aside, and Judah and Joseph are the main leaders, and even through history become the main leaders of the nation of Israel, with Judah, of course, becoming the supreme and everlasting tribe. The leadership, King David comes from Judah, and God promises that King David and his family will reign forever over Israel. But here we're at the very beginning of nationhood, and Reuben, as a tribe, is looking around and saying, hey, wait a second, we're the firstborn. Why is it that Moses and Aaron get all the credit? Now you could say, all right, Aaron, the tribe of the Levites, whatever, maybe they can do their thing in the temple. But what about the political leadership? Why Moses? Why is that also coming from the Levites? Okay, so that is where they're coming from. Now, very interesting, the figure of Datan and Aviram, their name is only mentioned here in this context of this story. And yet in Jewish tradition, and particularly in the Midrash, their name features everywhere. Now, this is an opportunity for me to give you a bit of an introduction as to one of the ways Midrash acts to interpret and expand on the information that we have in the Bible itself. Midrash is sourced back to the Second Temple period, although the actual written versions of the Midrash come later. The earliest versions of the Midrash are probably 3rd, 4th century, something like that. And the later ones take us all the way into the Middle Ages. But the people they quote as the sources of their statements are people that lived during and after and immediately after the Second Temple period. So this is very ancient traditions. Rather than, now during the Middle Ages, there were many commentaries, Jewish commentators who wrote commentaries on the Bible. And those commentaries were written in a more traditional fashion that we can more or less understand. There'd be a particular verse, and they explain a difficult word, or they'll explain a situation, or they'll expound about, what idea, what's really going on here, giving you an understanding. The Midrash, and by the way, many of these medieval interpretations and later draw some of their ideas from the Midrash. The Midrash goes about in a completely different way. The Midrash is actually something that was originally spoken, not written. And for the most part, these were talks that were given by rabbis in study halls, in synagogues, in places of gathering. And they were very often talks that were given, the custom to read the Torah portion is a very ancient one, goes back to the beginning of the Second Temple period. We read in Ezra and Nehemiah where they gathered on Rosh Hashanah and they read from the Bible. And we believe that that was the beginning of this custom to read every single Shabbat a portion of the 5 books of Moses. There were different customs. Initially, it took them 3 years to do the cycle, and later on, the cycle that we have today, an annual cycle, became the prominent one. Anyway, so usually these things were spoken by a rabbi or a teacher, and it wasn't expounding on a particular verse as much, although that also was, but it was much more telling stories. And very often, what the Midrash does, it takes the story of the Bible itself and expands it with additional information, or tells a sub-story, another story that can give you background as to what's going on. And many people, when they hear this, are saying, wait a second, we have one Bible, why do we have all these other stories? And it's very important to understand that when these stories were told, many of them may reflect ancient oral traditions of what may really have happened. But these were never incorporated into the Bible, so you have no obligation to believe that this is God's spoken word. However, the Midrash itself, the style is to use a story to make a point. So some of these stories are clearly things that never happened. Some of them are fantastical with all kinds of, supernatural kind of happenings that is clear, mountains talking to each other. Nobody ever believed that a mountain talked to another. So in order to get across a point, in those days, they did it by a story. People always like to hear a story and then they learn the message. Okay, now, one of the techniques of the Midrash, and one of the things the Midrash loves to do, Midrash does not like anonymous people in the Bible. Very often, if the Bible tells a story about a person who doesn't have a name, okay, they will then say, oh, and they will connect that anonymous person with a person whose name shows up somewhere later on. Very often what the Midrash is saying, now again, it could be that there's a tradition that indeed that anonymous person is this other person. But more importantly than that, what the Midrash is saying is there's something about the characteristics or the behavior of that person that we know from his identity with his name that reflects back on these anonymous people. Now, Datan and Aviram, these two characters, which feature here as major rebels and major troublemakers, the Midrash identifies them with a series of other anonymous troublemakers from the slavery in Egypt until this point in time, okay? And I'm going to give you a few of them, but one of the best ones, I think, is one that I think you'll see right away why it is that what the Midrash is actually saying here, okay? In Exodus chapter 2, you'll recall Moses is a young man and he's going out for the first time to search for his brothers. And there are 2 incidences that he encounters. The first one, he sees an Egyptian man beating a Jewish man, and a Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian man and buries him in the sand, okay? And he figures he's getting away with that. The next day he goes out and there are two Hebrews, two Jewish men, arguing and fighting with one another. And so he goes up to them and he says, why are you fighting? And what do they say? This is Exodus 2, verse 14. Their response to him was, who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And of course, at that point, Moses understands that the fact that he killed the Egyptian is well known. And so he runs away to Egypt. But pay attention to the beginning of this. What does he say? What do they say, these two people? Who made you chief and ruler over us? This is so similar to the statement in our story of Datan and Abiram, which we just read. Let me just go back. Which we just read, and he says, why do you raise yourselves above the congregation? In other words, in both cases, you have people that are saying, who made you leader? Why are you the boss? Who put you as boss over me? And therefore, the Midrash is saying it's the same person. Now, historically, it is possible, although at least 60 years would have passed since the original period of time. Moses was a young man. He was somewhere between the age of 17 and 20, something like that, when he goes out to check on his brothers. And he's 80 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. And now they've left Egypt. So it's, let's say, 2 years later. Okay. So it's 60 plus years has passed since that original. So it's possible that Datan and Abiram were young men at the time. And today they're the same ages. That could have been Moses' age then and Moses' age now. It's all very possible. But again, I don't think it's the historical reality that is important, but it is this idea that you have a characteristic of people within the nation. I will call them troublemakers who show up again and again. Now, there are other places where this happens, where the Midrash connects Datan and Abiram to anonymous people. One is most of them are in the book of Exodus. One in the book of Exodus, chapter 5, where Moses has just gone before Pharaoh. Pharaoh is very angry, and he piles up much more work on the children of Israel. And the policemen, now these policemen are Jewish, who are appointed by the Egyptians to be foremen, work foremen over the Hebrew slaves. They themselves are slaves, but they are elevated, they get better privileges, but they also are the ones who have to enforce the slavery. They're not the most savory types, as you can well imagine. And at the point at which they're making them work harder, and the policemen themselves are being abused by the Egyptians, we see in verse 19, now the foremen of the Israelites found themselves in trouble because of the order, you must not reduce your daily quantity of bricks. As they left Pharaoh's presence, they came upon Moses and Aaron standing in their path, and they said to them, may the Lord look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his couriers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us. So these are people that are very angry at Moses and Aaron and blame them. For them, God is not in the picture, okay? They blame them for making their situation harder. And to a certain degree, you see here that there's an identification with Egypt. Even though they're somewhat caught in the middle, they come to a point where there's a certain identification. Now, in chapter 14 of Exodus, when the children of Israel are standing in front of the Red Sea, we see in verse 10, chapter 14, verse 10, as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them, greatly frightened. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Here again, the Midrash identifies the people who actually made this call. Not all of Israel, but Datan and Abiram. Either that they were the instigators of this cry, or that they themselves were the ones who made the cry. Now, let's compare this kind of a cry to something else that we hear from Datan and Abiram later on in our story. The same chapter, we're in chapter 16, verse 13. This is Datan and Abiram at one point, this is what they say to Moses. Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey from a land flowing with milk and honey? Get this one. What's the land flowing with milk and honey to Datan and Abiram? Egypt, not Israel. Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, that you would also lord it over us? Okay, so this sounds very much, in this case, in the case of the complaint of Datan and Abiram, they go back and echo complaints that we see all along. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Egypt was great. We saw two weeks ago in the portion, it was a land of watermelon and zucchini and fish and all these wonderful things. This is Datan and Abiram. This is their style, okay? And one last thing we see here in chapter 14, Numbers chapter 14, which is in the last week's Torah portion, when we're in the whole encounter with the spies, and after the spies bring back their report, we have verse 4, Numbers 14, verse 4. Now I'll go back to verse 2. All the Israelites rallied against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in the land of Egypt, the whole community shouted at them, or if only we might die in the wilderness. Why is the Lord taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children would be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. So this is something that everyone said. And then look at verse 4. And one man said to his brother, or one said to another, let us head back for Egypt. So here we have anonymous. So the whole nation is talking. Take us back to Egypt. What did you take us out of Egypt? And then we have one to another. And again, you have an anonymous person who is actually doing this talking. Here it's no longer the whole nation. It's one to another. Who is the one to another? And here again, the Midrash ascribes this to Datan and Abiram. These are the troublemakers. These are the people who not only defy the authority of Moses, going back all the way to Egypt, but they feel connected to Egypt. They don't want to leave Egypt. They don't understand this is the land of milk and honey. They don't understand why they had to leave. Now, there is a third, so that was the second group of people. The third group of people are the 250 princes of the tribes. And here again, we can talk about a jealousy. Remember, the princes of the tribes were probably all firstborns, because that's usually what happens. It would have been the firstborn of a particular family of the tribe that would be these princes. And therefore, it's very possible that they are upset by being replaced. We read this a few weeks ago, how the firstborns who were initially slated to be the ones who would serve in the tabernacle are being replaced by the Levites. And so it's also very possible that this is where their resentment is coming from. Now, interestingly, Moses responds to each group in kind. Each one gets a punishment or has a response that is makes sense based upon what they want. So first of all, again, in our Torah portion now, verses 8 to 10, Moses addresses himself to Korach, and he basically says to them, I don't understand you guys. You're already Levites. You already have very important positions in the temple. Why you also need to have the priesthood? Aaron, of course, is the priesthood. And they're basically saying God has already selected you to have a special position in the temple separate from all the rest of Israel. But that's not good enough for you. It's not enough that you're the Levites. You also have to be the priests. You have to be like Aaron. And so this is his criticism. This is how he responds to them. Now, the punishment that comes, well, I'm going to get to the punishment for Korach. Okay, Korach's punishment comes together with Datan and Abiram. Okay? Datan and Abiram, as we said, talk about leaving, complaining about why Moses brought him out of Egypt. But very interestingly, when Moses, and we see this in verse 12, Moses wants to address that he addressed Korach and his group. He wants to address now Datan and Abiram and his group, and they won't listen to him. They don't even want to come. They send a messenger. They said, where'd you take us out of this land for? And we read that verse already. Okay. Both of these groups have a very severe punishment together. The earth opens up and swallows them whole. Okay? Now, what we see in these two is that both of them were jealous and both of them were seeking ego, essentially. They wanted glory. They wanted a higher position than they had been given. And what is their punishment? They're swallowed up whole. There's no grave. There's no memory. These people are erased from the earth. They're swallowed into the earth. The people who wanted, and you can imagine people like this who are so into their ego. These are people probably who would have wanted this huge tomb marking their presence on earth over their grave. It goes together with that egotistical way of looking at things. And God says, you're going to be swallowed whole without a trace. No one is going to remember who you were, although we have the story. But, we're not going to have this memorial to Datan and Abiram and Korach and their gang. Okay? Now, the 250, how did they die? They brought an incense. They had these incense rods that they were going to bring. And they're not, of course, supposed to bring incense. Incense is only supposed to be brought by the priest. Basically, what God is saying, okay, you think you should be the priests? You think you're the ones instead of the Levites, you should be the priests? Okay, bring your incense. Let's see what happens. And of course, what happens is God sends a fire down and destroys all those 250. So it's very much, the punishment is very much suited to the motivation or to the nature of the problem that lies behind the rebellion of each one. Now, afterwards, in chapter 18, when all of this is over, God then speaks to Aaron and his sons. And it's very interesting here because this is some of the things that he says here we already know already. He says, for example, in chapter 2, you shall also associate yourself with your kinsmen, the tribe of Levi. Your ancestral tribe to be attached to you and to minister to you, while you and your sons under your charge over for the 10th of the pact. We know from already before when in a few weeks ago, when we read about the replacement of the Levites, when Levites replaced the firstborn, we learned already that the Levites have a very important role in the tabernacle alongside the priests. So this is not telling us anything new. However, what it is turning to the Levites, and God is basically saying to the priests, he's saying, don't see yourselves as better or separate from the Levites. You have different jobs and you have perhaps more serious responsibilities, but you need to understand that the Levites will be serving with you and under you. You must incorporate them. Don't separate yourself from them. And I think this perhaps is a sort of warning to Aaron and his sons at what can go wrong. I don't think that Aaron had done anything wrong, and the jealousy that we see had come through in Korach and his gang. It was not the fault of Aaron. However, God here is saying, this time, it was not your fault at all. But you as priests holding this very high and holy function must be very, very careful, not to lord it over anyone, but to include the Levites and to ensure that people are not looking out to replace you, to rebel against you. There isn't resentment. The other thing that he says here is that you have responsibility. The first verse in chapter 18, you and your sons and the ancestral house under your charge shall bear any guilt connected with the sanctuary. You and your sons alone shall bear any guilt connected with your priesthood. And this goes to show that the role of the priest is not about glory. It's about service, but it's also about responsibility. It's a serious job, not something that someone should be jealous of. There are people out there that says, oh, I want to be president or I want to be prime minister. And think about it for a second. You've got to be a little crazy to want to be president or prime minister. The enormous, yes, you get all the glory, you're famous, whatever. You get to talk to the bigwigs all over the world. But on the other hand, the enormity of the responsibility on your shoulders and what your ability to do harm as well as to do good is enormous. And that is something that should really give people pause. God has selected those who should do this, but there are pluses and minuses of every job. Maybe a bit more glory, but certainly a lot of responsibility.
Mhm, mhm.
Now, one more thing I want to just mention is something about Korach. Okay, we know he got swallowed up. And at the beginning, we understand, at the beginning of the portion, we learn that they have their whole families with them. I'm trying to see where that is. Okay, I don't see it right now, but at some point here at the beginning, it talks about how Korach has his whole family with him. He has a whole group of people with him, but that he also has his family. And yet later on, we learn about the sons of Korach. First of all, in Psalms, there are a number of Psalms that are attributed to the sons of Korach. Okay.
Right.
And we also learn in Chronicles that Korach really had a whole dynasty. He had descendants and ended up being Samuel, the prophet, was one of his descendants. And there was a man named Haman, a son of Joel, who was one of the people who wrote poetry and sang in the temple. And in fact, some people, when they talk about the sons of Korach singing the Psalms, they attributed to him. These are both, these are things that show up in Chronicles. So both in Chronicles and in Psalms, we have reference to descendants of Korach. So if they were all swallowed up in the earth, how did he have descendants? And so here again, the Midrash steps in and says, whereas initially they were all together, at some point, the sons of Korach understood that this was no good, and they separated themselves from their father and from this rebellion and were saved. And I think this is also a very, very important lesson to us that, you know, very often, and I think one of the lessons we have here about all these the Midrash stories that talk about Datan and Aviram are talking essentially about people who have sinister agendas, who have enormous influence and sway ordinary people to do things that they shouldn't do. Okay. And that is always a problem. Most times when there's a rebellion, when there's a whole lot of people doing something wrong, the source is only a few people that have managed to pull others with them because of their charisma, because of I don't know, their ability to couch their arguments in very cogent ways. And we see that was probably the case with Korach, certainly with Datan and Aviram. They pulled all these people with them. But what do we see when we think about the sons of Korach who saved themselves? At the end of the day, every individual has the ability and must take the responsibility to think for themselves. Am I really going to follow this person? Is this really the right thing to do? And we have the ability to step back and correct ourselves. And when we do, God, if you exclude yourself from the game, God excludes you from the punishment. And I think this is a very, very valuable message to all of us today. Whenever we see leaders who are trying to take us in directions that we believe are dangerous or wrong, always to be able to stand by and say, wait, is this a direction I want to be going in? Or do I want to take exception to this direction because it is the wrong thing to be doing? That's all I have to say for today in our Torah portion of Korach, but we have some time. If any of you want to comment, you can unmute yourselves and I'd love to hear you.
Well, I guess this is Maria speaking from Guatemala. So the comment I would have is the jealousy and the sin that started in these different groups. They should have at least be able to contemplate asking for what is God is going to tell us, as opposed to just taking themselves and for themselves the position to take over. Why they didn't ask for what is God telling you?
But you know what? It's even more fundamental than this. Unlike our leadership today, in the case of Moses and Aaron, it was very, very clear that they were sent by God and appointed by God.
That's right.
Beginning with Egypt, when they first came together for the nation, they came with signs from God, with direct messages from God, and a whole year of seeing all these plagues going on in the parting of the Red Sea. you know, you would think that they would have figured it
Exactly,
out. These were
exactly.
God's designated
That's
representatives.
right.
So it
Yes.
makes their rebellion even worse, because it's not
That's
just
what I
rebelling
mean.
against Moses and Aaron, they're rebelling against God.
Against God, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
100%.
Yeah. And then the other point I want to mention is, yes, if to be discerned, to discern not to follow leaders when they bring about all these wonderful things that apparently shine as gold, but I think we need all of us to follow the principles, you know, because they could give us, the leaders could show us all these wonderful things, but are they truly bringing the truth? And
Absolutely.
I think by following the truth is what can give us a firm foundation. In other words, to really analyze, to really inquire, and to follow via principles, not by the charisma and all other things that are superficial.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. Anybody else have something they'd like to share? That was wonderful, Maria.
What about comparisons to what's going on right now? Are there one or two quite strong egos in the whole leadership thing and the attempt to form a government? It seems to me that it's rather ironic that we are reading this Torah portion at this time when these things are going on in Israel with regard to a government there.
You know, I would say thank you, Rick. And I would connect it with what Maria's saying and say that unfortunately today we don't have leaders of the stature of Moses and Aaron who were directly appointed by God. Yeah. And so what we very often have to do is follow leaders, none of whom are perfect, many of whom are flawed in one way or the other. And then we have to see which leader, though, and I think this is key, which leader at least attempts to put the needs of the nation beyond his own ego.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not always simple to discern, because, you know, everybody wants to be number one. What's going on in Israel today, I would say that the reason Netanyahu has lost the prime ministership, despite being an extremely talented prime minister, is because he let his ego get in the way. And unfortunately, in the last year or two, there were too many incidents that he was perceived as acting in ways that were more to benefit his own personal position than to benefit the nation. And it's unfortunate because, as I said, he was, you know, probably Israel's most talented prime minister. Whether the new group coming in is going to be able to lead the country effectively, I have no idea. There's a whole group of them that I can see them cooperating. Those on the right, like Saar, Lieberman, Bennett, these are all right-wing parties. And some of the people in Gantz's party are also right-wing. So they're not just, you know, get along, but they have unity of ideology. Some of the people in the center, you can see them being able to cooperate because their positions are the same on some issues, and on others not that far apart. There are room for compromise. What none of us can figure out is how the far left parties and the Arab party are going to fit into that equation. And nobody knows. And my feeling is, I've always liked Naftali Bennett. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's see what he can do, and we'll take it from there. But like you said, Maria, you know, at the end of the day, it's the principles that are important. And we have to make sure that these people are acting in at least what they determine or what they believe is the interest of the nation.
Well,
that's time will tell that.
That's the very issue. They were unified because they wanted to bring down Bibi.
Well,
but
not all of them.
No, but in general.
I think what happened was, that is what a lot of people are saying, but it's really not accurate. Some of them, yes. Some of the people in those parties were together and their whole thing was, you know, just get rid of Bibi. Bennett, on the other hand, was willing to be in a government with Bibi if there was a government. But the problem is Bibi couldn't put together a government. And the reason he couldn't put together a government because he had alienated so many politicians over the past couple years.
Okay.
And then the question is, what is better for the nation? A
Mhm.
compromise sort of government or fifth elections? And here I agree with Bennett that would have been a terrible thing to have fifth elections, because all these elections not only are wasting enormous amounts of money, but it's tearing the
Right.
nation apart.
Yeah.
And we need a little quiet. Will this new government bring the quiet? I have no idea. Prayer is a good thing right now.
Yeah,
That's all I can say.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Anyway, so good to see you all. We will see you again, please God, next week. Have a wonderful weekend and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.